and brothers, welcome to African History Club. But I would like to amend the title of the podcast a little bit. I want to call it African History Club / Not Yet Uhuru. Uhuru, of course, is the Kiswahili word for independence. And when I say Not Yet Uhuru, many of you who are familiar with African history would recognize that term. It comes from the book Not Yet Uhuru, published in the 1960s by Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who was the father of Raila Odinga. He was a prominent Kenyan politician, and most recently was a candidate for the African Union Executive Chair Commission. So Africa is truly not yet Uhuru. I don't know of a single independent African country. I mean, after all, what was the purpose of the Berlin Conference in 1884, 1885? It was not just to partition Africa. Yes, that was one of the objectives. Partition the African continent. But then once they partitioned, what did they do? They turned African countries into plantations, producers of what they call cash crops, products that they cannot eat: tobacco, coffee, tea, cotton, cocoa, sisal, you name it. And these products were to go into the European industry, into the factories, to produce manufacturers. So that was the one side of it. The second side, of course, was basically enslaved labor, right? Yes, it's slightly different from the plantation of the Old South in the United States, in the sense that they got some wages, just sufficient to keep them alive. But it was labor exploitation. That was the third objective of the Berlin Agenda. The third, that was the second. The third was to turn them into captive market consumers of the products that are manufactured in Europe with the raw material produced in Africa by Africans for cheap. And then there was resource plunder, of course. In the early stages, you had rubber, you had ivory, and of course, remember the homicidal regime of Leopold II, of the Belgians, in what he called the Congo Free State. So horrific, so genocidal that the Belgian state took control of it, and it became Belgian Congo. It was still horrific, but it was less genocidal than Leopold's regime. So that was the agenda, the Berlin Agenda, the Berlin Conference. So what has changed since the Berlin Conference? We claim that we have independent African countries, correct? We have African, quote-unquote, presidents and prime ministers, but are they really presiding over independent countries? Let's look at the economic structure. They still produce cocoa, coffee, cotton, tobacco. Sisal is no longer on the list because now the system has found synthetic products to replace sisal. They still produce what they call primary products. And then they have the minerals. They have copper, they have coltan, they have manganese, they have uranium, you name it, cobalt, you name it. Mineral resources, gold, diamond. But even those are still shipped overseas as raw material. They're not processed into manufactured products in any African country. Their labor is still exploited. They produce those cheap and they ship it overseas. And then those are turned into manufactured products, and then once they're turned into manufactured products, they're shipped back to Africa. Africans buy those same products, which is produced with the raw materials they produce, with the labor exploited by the system. So what is the difference? What has changed in terms of the economic structure? Nothing. So that's why I say it is really hard to claim that we have independent African countries. We need to work toward independence. And that takes me to the next subject. The recent cancellation, elimination of foreign aid by the United States government under President Donald Trump. Philosophically, I am opposed to foreign aid because that's another way of keeping Africa and Africans dependent and marginalized at the peripheral location of the global economy. And you do that by giving them aid and making them dependent. And now we're seeing the consequences. In South Africa, for example, where a quarter of the budget of their healthcare operation to deal with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, a quarter of it was financed from U.S. funds, USAID. Many other projects throughout different African countries, the same thing. And now we are paying the price of this dependency. In that particular case, of course, I do not approve of that. I think it's wrong to just cut it off overnight when people have now become dependent on that source for their medication, life-sustaining medication. So that is wrong. But generally, aid is not the way to move forward. Aid is what has kept Africa dependent. If aid was supposed to work, why is it that there's not a single economically developed African country today? Ask yourself that simple question. African countries have been getting so-called aid since Ghana won independence in 1957 as the first African country south of the Sahara to win its uhuru from Britain. It got aid, it got World Bank financing, it got assistance from the IMF. World Bank financing went into the Akosombo, the Volta River project, which of course is an admirable project. You have to give credit for Kwame Nkrumah for having that vision and foresight. Even though they ended up overthrowing him in 1966 in a CIA-backed US coup, he left a legacy by building that, the Volta River project. Even up to date, it provides aid, it provides energy, power to Ghana and neighboring countries. But otherwise, aid has kept African countries dependent. And whether it's funds from the World Bank, whether it's financial support from the IMF, whether it's from the EU, the European countries, from Britain, from the United States, whether it's multilateral, whether it's bilateral, there is no single case where that has been able to transform any African country into a developed economy, because that's not the purpose. Ask yourself another logical question. If you're not persuaded by what I'm saying, ask yourself this question. These are capitalist countries, right? The countries that provide the so-called aid. These are all capitalist countries. So ask yourself, why would they want to help develop another country to become a competitor on the global market? Does that make sense to you? That's like a US corporation within the United States going to another corporation saying, I want to assist you so you can become productive, so you can compete with my company. Does that make sense to you? So if you're not persuaded by what I said earlier, think about that. It doesn't make sense. They're not in the business of creating other competitors. In fact, they try to undermine other companies, or they try to undermine other countries. You see? Or they reach mutual pacts They say you export this amount, import this amount, and they have agreements, right? But Africa does not even play in that equation. We're not on the table. We're kept at the periphery of the global system. Our economy still operates under the Berlin agenda. Produce cheap, raw materials, whether it's agricultural, whether it's mineral, natural resources, cheap labor, sell it to Europe, sell it to China and other industrialized parts of the world, and then import the manufacturers at an exponentially much, much higher price. We need to change that. Kwame Nkrumah tried to change that, and that's why he built the Volta River Project. He wanted to use the money to power factories in Ghana so that Ghana could also industrialize. And as he wrote in Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, unless African countries united, we would not be able to protect our raw materials, our natural resources, our human resources. He said, if they wanted it so badly to the extent that they colonized African countries, they used force, they used wars of extermination to conquer, what makes you think they will not continue the same system even after so-called independence? We'll not be able to protect our sovereignty and our natural resources. And he was correct. History has now absorbed him completely. And another thing he warned about, he said, we need to become food self-sufficient. I think that's on page 29 in the book, which I highly recommend, by the way. Comrades, if you don't have it, that's a book worth getting. Let's become food self-sufficient. Again, he has been totally vindicated. Today, Africa imports $35 billion worth of food annually from outside Africa. Think about that. Yet we have the most abundant, fertile land to produce food. We have water, we have rivers, we have lakes, we have mountains, water running down from the slopes. We have wind, we have sun, and yet we're importing food from Europe. Think about that. $35 billion that could go into sustaining our own farmers. We're sending to Europe to import grains. Nkrumah once again vindicated, completely absolved. You see? He was talking about true independence, where you decide what you want to produce, where you produce what your economy needs and what your economy consumes. You don't produce what the economy does not need or consume because you want to export it overseas. That is what we do with the tea, with the cocoa, with the tobacco, with the cotton. If you're going to produce those products, then turn it into manufacturers. Use the cotton to produce the clothes you wear instead of importing the clothes, right? Turn the cocoa into chocolate instead of selling it cheap. And then when I walk into Whole Foods, you see it packaged in some fancy box because it's been run through some factory. And now it costs like, what, 15, 20, in some chocolate specialty stores, you know, tiny boxes for $50, $75, $100, you see? You're giving your money away. So our economy still operates under the Berlin system, the Berlin agenda. That is why it's very misleading for us to claim that any African country is independent. Of course, it's easier said than done, although it can be easily done. In other words, we know what needs to be done for African countries to build their own viable, self-sustaining, growing, productive economies. They need to stop selling raw materials. They need to start using it to manufacture. How is it that there's not a single industrialized African country when the technology is widely available? It's not rocket science, you know? But they've become so dependent. They would have to make decisions that we are going to use our resources for manufacturing within Africa. And when you make a decision like that, that's a bold political statement, and imperialism does not like that. Because now you're talking self-sufficiency and independence. You see? Thomas Sankara tried that in Burkina Faso. He knew that it starts with the mind. So when he came to power, he changed the name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, land of the upright people. You see? And then he said, look at your plate. If the food is imported, that's the evidence of imperialism. So he had land reform. People had access to land. Within 3 years, Burkina Faso was food self-sufficiency. He said, how can we develop if we're ignoring more than 50% of our population? The women. He gave them meaningful jobs, senior positions in government, recruiting them into the armed forces, you see? He said, we are watching the desert expand, the Sahel. We can do something about that. He launched a national tree building campaign, planting campaign. They planted millions of trees. This is in 1983. He had the foresight, you know, when some people are still debating whether there's a global climate change. He was already taking action in the 1980s. You see? A national program for mass education, national program for national healthcare system. He said, let's keep Africa's market for Africans. He said, produce what you consume and consume what you produce. Every African leader, instead of having their useless portraits on the walls of the state house, government buildings, remove those useless pictures, portraits of African leaders. Instead, make a frame that contains the words Sankara uttered and put that on the wall. Produce what you consume, consume what you produce. That's what we need. We don't need to be celebrating these leaders who are not delivering on behalf of Africa. You see? So it starts with independence. Independence to have the choice and the command and the power to make the decisions of how we want to manage our economies and how we want and what we want to produce in our economies. So that's my first contribution for today. Independence, independence, independence. Or in Kiswahili, uhuru, uhuru, uhuru. Thank you, sisters and brothers.